Some cases from crime reports are so shocking that one loses faith in humanity. Today, we will talk about one of the most terrifying duos that operated in Australia, people who may have hidden dozens of victims who remain in the archives of unsolved cases. Sian Kingi was born on December 16, 1974, in New Zealand. Her family later moved to Australia, where they lived in the small Australian town of Nunga, which has a population of about 5,000. This town is located on the coast in a paradisiacal, warm place. From a young age, Sian was sweet and kind, loved sports and dancing, particularly ballet and netball. By nature, she was modest, but she could charm everyone she met, which made her very popular among her peers. She was beautiful, tall, had long blonde hair, and extraordinary eyes. The student definitely stood out with her appearance. Unfortunately, it was exactly that which became her downfall. Friday, November 27, 1987, was a typical weekday. Sian had just finished her lessons. It was a beautiful sunny day. Normally, the weather here at this time is perfect, with hot sun and cool wind, making it ideal for the locals to relax on the beach. At the store, Linda Kingi was shopping. The woman wanted to buy groceries and fabric to sew her daughter a nice dress for her upcoming birthday. The parents wanted to hold a party for the occasion and were actively preparing for the event. After school, Sian got on her yellow bicycle, knowing that she had to help choose the fabric. Her mother wanted to buy exactly what her daughter would like, so the student went straight to the store after school. Mother and daughter chose the fabric for the dress, as they only had time in the afternoon. Immediately after the shopping, Linda wanted to stop by the bakery to buy pastries for dinner. Sian was already very tired and wanted to go home. She found choosing fabrics very tiring, but she asked to be allowed to go home so that she could meet up with her mother later. Linda gave her permission to go, and so the student set off on her favorite short route. She had traveled this route hundreds of times, but today she wasn't as confident as usual. In the 80s, Nunga was a quiet provincial town. People here knew each other well, and so the town was considered one of the safest in the area. The Kingi family's house was only a few kilometers from the store and was reachable by bicycle in just a few minutes. Linda was confident that her 12-year-old daughter was safe because nothing bad had ever happened in their quiet town. Her mother even wanted to follow her right after the shopping, which shouldn't have taken long. At 4:45 p.m., Sian got on her bike and rode off. The path led the student through the park to the house. Linda went the other way after buying some pastries and drove directly to the house, albeit in the other direction by car. Since the student was not moving too quickly, the difference between the two was only a few minutes. Presumably, the woman arrived at the house just a few minutes after her daughter arrived on her bicycle. When Linda returned, she found the yellow bicycle in front of the house, but the student was not at home. Initially, this didn't alarm the woman, as the girl might have met a friend along the way or gone to visit a friend. It was the weekend after a long school week, and the teenagers often met up after school to spend time together. The girl had many friends, so she regularly stopped by to visit someone. Especially now that she and her mother had picked out a lovely fabric, the student could have simply visited one of her friends to show it off. A meeting with friends was also planned for the weekend, so Sian could have visited some of her future guests to discuss the upcoming event. But soon, her mother began to worry. Sian was well behaved and never left the house for long periods without permission. As a precaution, Linda decided to call several friends whose children were in contact with her daughter. The woman wanted to make sure the girl was with them, but to her mother's horror, no one had seen Sian. By 8 p.m., the student had still not come home. Although it was a small, quiet town with little crime, Sian always adhered to the agreed-upon time and never went out after sunset. Of course, on Friday evening, people started to relax and go for walks after their hard work. In the darkness, even the safest small town could become a very dangerous place. The adult woman understood this and finally Linda decided to take the route her daughter regularly took by bicycle. The path on the right side was the shortest route from their house on the outskirts to the shops in town. Together with her husband, they followed this path and found Sian's yellow bicycle lying abandoned halfway along. The girl was nowhere to be seen, and there seemed to be no trace of her. Nevertheless, the abandoned bicycle was more than suspicious. It was the girl's first vehicle of her own, and she valued it greatly. Sian had wanted it for a long time. The bike was a big achievement for the schoolgirl, and she would never have left it unattended. Unfortunately, the girl was not found nearby. Her parents called out for her, but no one responded. Linda and her husband naturally decided to go to the police. The couple stopped by the house to make sure she hadn't returned. Armed with a photo of Sian, they went to the police station. The officers took the parents' report about their daughter's disappearance and immediately declared the child missing. Everyone knew that the town was a close-knit community with virtually no crime, so it was assumed that the girl would be quickly found and that it was just a simple misunderstanding. Perhaps the teenager was with a friend or had gotten lost during a walk in the woods. Nonetheless, the parents' words aroused great suspicion, which the officers didn't dare to voice in order not to frighten the parents in advance. One of the officers remembered that there had been an abduction in the area shortly before this incident. The officers decided to contact the local media. Since there were no social networks and no internet, they opted for classic methods. The morning news reported on Sian's disappearance, assuming that in this way they would at least find some witnesses who had seen the 12-year-old student the previous night. Several people contacted the station, providing information to the police. Simultaneously, they all claimed not to have seen any suspicious situations. As it turned out, the witnesses had noticed Linda and Sian when they were choosing fabric for a future dress. No one, however, had seen the girl on her way home, let alone anyone walking along the path at that time. Witnesses gave different explanations. Attempts were made to highlight suspicions, such as strange cars or other residents behaving unusually, but no one saw anyone following Linda and Sian. One witness spoke of a dirty white station wagon from an older model seen that evening. When he contacted the police, he reported that there was a dark-haired man and a slender woman in the passenger compartment of the car. They seemed to be aimlessly driving around, perhaps looking for someone. Witnesses had seen the suspicious couple shortly before their disappearance. The police handling the case counted the vehicles, and the authorities identified about 170,000 station wagons in the area, of which around 10,000 were white. This greatly expanded the search area. It was necessary to familiarize themselves with all the vehicles in the region and verify other leads. Dozens of police officers and hundreds of volunteers were involved in the search. Many relatives, friends, and neighbors of the family, as well as other affected people, volunteered in the search for the girl. Ground and air search resources were used. Photos were taken from the site where the teenager disappeared and then published in the media. This is a standard method used to awaken witnesses' memories of the day's events. Unfortunately, no one was able to provide the law enforcement authorities with valuable information. However, by Sunday, several new witnesses came forward and significantly advanced the investigation. The first witness was sunbathing near a creek in the woods when she was attacked by an unknown man. He harassed the victim and tried to drag her into his vehicle, which turned out to be the aforementioned white Holden Kingwood station wagon. A second witness saw this moment and helped the woman fend off the attacker. The man then pursued the vehicle as its driver attempted to flee the scene, but he soon lost sight of it. He was able to describe the car in detail and give the police the vehicle's license plate number. It was 429. The investigators decided to check this number against the police database, and it turned out that this license plate was indeed registered in the area. They managed to determine that the vehicle belonged to a woman named Wilma Bigg. The investigators quickly found her address and went to the house where the car's owner lived. An older man opened the door for them and confirmed that he knew the owner of the vehicle. According to the man, he was not related to Wilma, but his stepson Barry turned out to be her husband. They had been married for about a year. Barry's description closely matched the portrait created based on a witness's words from the incident at the creek. The suspect's name was Barry John Watts. The officers had no grounds to arrest him or accuse him of the girl's abduction. However, the owner of the vehicle and her husband were now considered suspects. Unfortunately, the man didn't know where the couple was, but he mentioned that they frequently changed residences, renting apartments and constantly moving around, which seemed suspicious. 3 days after Sian's disappearance, the police were contacted by another witness. This man also described a white Holden Kingwood that had been seen near the creek. He described the driver as having an athletic build and the woman as a plump figure. Both were acting very suspiciously. An hour after this statement, the police conducted a background check on Wilma and Barry. It turned out that both had been released from prison in Perth, Western Australia, just before the events occurred. Both had extensive criminal records. Only a few weeks before these events, the two had moved from Perth to Queensland to escape strict supervision after being released on parole. The criminals arrived in their sedan, but almost immediately exchanged it for a white station wagon, which had already been involved in several suspicious incidents. The police realized that they were dealing with dangerous criminals who had more than one crime on their record. Their offenses included armed robberies, burglaries, forgery of documents needed to obtain rights, fraudulent activities, and that was only part of these criminals' record. For the Kingi family, this was, of course, terrible news. If their daughter had been involved with these people, the chances of finding her alive and unharmed were minimal. Barry was 33 years old at the time. His wife Wilma was 43. The woman had 6 children from previous relationships. Both were considered extremely dangerous criminals and were wanted by the police. Now, the police urgently needed to locate the couple and determine if they had anything to do with the schoolgirl's disappearance. Meanwhile, 6 days after Sian's disappearance, a man named Tim arrived at the police station with bad news. He said that on the previous evening, on his way to work, he had noticed a foul smell in a park, which caught his attention because he thought that perhaps an animal had died. On his way back, he became even more curious because the unbearable smell of decomposition was still present in the same spot. Off the road, near a creek, he found the body of a teenager. The girl was dressed in a school uniform and had blonde hair. The police officers arrived at the location immediately. There, they found the mutilated body of the student. The girl had clearly been sexually assaulted. There were also strangulation marks on her neck from a foreign object, as well as 12 stab wounds on her body. 3 of the stab wounds were located around the heart, and 2 had cut through her throat. The girl's spine was broken, and her arms were so mutilated that they were practically detached from her body. The student's death was extremely agonizing. The police immediately assumed that the missing girl was in front of them. She was wearing the same clothes and matched her mother's description. The coroner confirmed in the lab that the found victim was indeed the 12-year-old Sian Kingi. 5 days after the gruesome discovery, the family and friends of the child gathered to say their goodbyes at her funeral. During the farewell ceremony, one of her classmates read a passage from Peter Pan, suggesting that his friend would forever remain a child. Flowers were laid along the path near the place where the tortured girl was found. After the media made the incident public, another woman contacted the police. It was a nurse named Nicole Close. She reported that she had also seen suspicious people driving a white station wagon in the area. One day, after finishing her shift at the hospital in the late afternoon, the witness was walking across the parking lot to her car when she noticed a white vehicle driving slowly and sneaking up on her. Nicole immediately felt that something was wrong, so she ran to her car, jumped inside, and locked the door. The station wagon didn't reverse, but stopped at the passenger door, and a man got out. He approached the window and asked for help with directions on a map to find a specific place. The driver seemed calm and friendly enough, which made the nurse hesitate and even step out of her car. She wanted to end the conversation quickly because she noticed a suspicious-looking woman in the station wagon and also thought she saw some ropes lying on the back seat. Moreover, the nurse felt scared, as if she was in danger. The man behaved very calmly and politely, and with every word, he took a small step closer to the nurse. Nicole explained the directions several times, but he kept repeating the question and kept getting closer. When he was only a few steps away from the nurse, she saw a stranger walking across the parking lot. The driver of the white car noticed him too, looked away, and hesitated. Taking advantage of the situation, the witness jumped back into her car. The nurse shut the door and simply drove away. According to her, the incident occurred on November 2nd, so well before Sian's disappearance. The investigators didn't consider the whole story about the white car a coincidence and followed up on the lead. They showed the new witness several photos, and she clearly identified Wilma Baker and Barry Watts among a lineup of unknown faces. But even that wasn't the end of the witness statements. The day after this statement, a new eyewitness came forward at the station and reported another attempted abduction. He said he had seen a stranger attack a woman on the street, hold a knife to her throat, and try to drag her into his car. It was again a white station wagon. The victim, however, began to fight back and even managed to injure the attacker's hand with his own knife before she could break free and escape. Luckily, the police were able to find fingerprints on her car that belonged to the suspect, Barry Watts. They also identified a number of perpetrators who were probably planning abductions, rapes, and murders in the area. The officers realized that some particularly dangerous criminals were roaming freely and posing a threat to the entire region, so they issued a warning. The two criminals were also placed on the wanted list, along with the white car that the couple was driving. Information about the wanted individuals was shared with the media. The criminals seemed to have gone underground, but now, with the alert in place, their data was available to all police stations in the country. It was only a matter of time before they were caught. In a small town, an employee of the local electricity company was busy installing power lines when he accidentally discovered a car that resembled the description of the station wagon the criminals were using. He remembered this thanks to a media report he had seen a few days earlier. After confirming that the vehicle was indeed being sought by the police, he immediately went to the station and pointed out on a map where he had seen the vehicle. When the police patrol arrived at the scene, it turned out that the criminals had already fled. The officers were on their trail, but were once again unable to catch them. The department received information about a money transfer made by the suspects while they were on their way out of New South Wales. The station wagon was located in a hotel parking lot. Fortunately, it was still parked there when the police arrived. The hotel staff granted access to the fugitive's room. The officers were well aware that they were dealing with particularly dangerous criminals who might be armed, so they kept their weapons ready. Contrary to the officers' expectations, the suspects offered no resistance and were arrested in the hotel room. The officers found wigs, hair dye, and a hair-cutting machine, which indicated that the couple was trying to change their appearance to successfully evade the police. The interrogation of the suspects lasted about 12 hours. During this time, Barry Watts did not attempt to escape, nor did he say anything to the police. In addition, there was obviously a conspiracy between him and his wife to stick to the same story and not reveal any valuable information. Nevertheless, the police managed to break Wilma Baker relatively quickly. The woman believed she could mitigate her punishment by cooperating and told the authorities a story that would make anyone's blood run cold. According to the criminal's version, on November 27th, she and her husband wandered the streets of the town. The reason for this was the search for a new victim, as Barry was obsessed with violence against women and especially preferred victims who were much younger than him. His wife was 10 years older and far from his ideal. To satisfy his unhealthy lust, Barry began to rape and kill those who were younger and prettier, matching his taste, and Wilma simply went along with it because she was a frailing in the relationship and getting a divorce, or so she claimed. On that fateful day, Barry decided to find the girl at any cost and be her first man. His wife was supposed to help him kidnap the child, and she agreed to do so. That Friday morning, they drove around for hours. The criminals thought it wouldn't be difficult to catch a girl. In reality, however, most potential victims were in groups, making it impossible to abduct one of them quietly. Initially, Barry tried to speak to several victims himself, but they managed to get away. Eventually, he realized that he was far less trustworthy than his wife and decided to use Wilma as bait to lure the victims. They then stopped near a local park and took a walk. On their way, the perpetrators saw an attractive girl riding her yellow bicycle leisurely. Barry chose her. Wilma waved to her in a friendly manner, and the unsuspecting child was asked to help the woman, who appeared to be struggling to catch her dog. The girl was distracted and started talking to Wilma, trying to be helpful, as she was naturally good-hearted. At that moment, Barry attacked Sian from behind. He covered her mouth with his hand and dragged her into his dirty vehicle. There, the criminal wrapped tape around her and tied her up. Wilma stayed with the child in the back seat, while her husband took the driver's seat. Altogether, they drove several kilometers away from the abduction site and stopped in the woods. Here, the pervert laid out a large blanket and began to rape the girl. For several hours, he fulfilled his most depraved fantasies. According to Barry's wife, Sian didn't cry during this torture, not even once. She was very brave, endured everything, and did what the criminal told her to do, apparently in the hope that she would be released. Wilma also thought that Sian didn't need to be killed and could simply be left here once her husband was done. But he never intended to leave her alive from the start. To satisfy his sick fantasies, the man began to strangle and stab the schoolgirl. The injuries were fatal for the 12-year-old, and Wilma watched the entire time. The woman reported that the belt used to strangle the girl, the knife, and the blanket were all thrown into a nearby creek. The police went to the scene, and everything the woman described was indeed found. At the supposed site of the rape and murder, they discovered light-colored hair that seemed to belong to Sian. Wilma's confession was 28 pages long. She described in great detail all the horrors that Sian endured before her death. The police never managed to break Barry, but he was furious when he learned of his wife's confession. To ensure that the man would be put behind bars, the investigators wanted to obtain his confession, but it was impossible to crack him. Therefore, the officers resorted to a rather sophisticated method. It was suggested that an undercover officer be placed in the temporary holding cell where Barry was being held. He was to spend all his time pretending to be a regular inmate. The undercover officer's task was to get to know the criminal, befriend him, and thus obtain a confession. A 32-year-old police officer was selected for this dangerous mission. After all, he had to hear the confession of the brutal massacre of a schoolgirl and couldn't show any disgust toward the perpetrator. During the entire operation, the officer struggled to suppress the urge to strangle Barry. After the operation, he was so emotionally drained that he had to take a sick leave to recover. However, the mission was a failure. It was impossible to obtain a confession. The extent of this monster's brutality was staggering. The forensic experts called the murder of Sian the most brutal case in their experience. But Barry remained undeterred and was determined to avoid punishment at all costs. During one of the meetings with his wife, he subtly suggested that she should take her own life before the trial so that she wouldn't have to testify against him, because otherwise she would be unhappy. According to state law, the witness's testimony would then be invalid. Generally, he communicated very carefully with his wife and chose his words meticulously to ensure that the authorities couldn't use the phone conversation as evidence of his guilt. Fortunately, Wilma didn't listen to her husband. When the couple was brought to court, around 200 people gathered at the entrance, wanting to look the brutal murderers in the eye. Everyone was concerned that the likelihood was high that the people would try to lynch the murderers. But to the surprise of the authorities, everyone remained silent as these monsters were led through the crowd. The townspeople were simply relieved that the police had ensured the safety of the town. A police officer was even moved to tears by this reaction. During the trial, Wilma testified against her husband and portrayed him as a true monster. In doing so, she tried to justify herself, claiming that she had been forced into this gruesome act by violence. In reality, however, there was every reason to believe that the woman had willingly participated in all of this. She herself shared an interesting fact, mentioning that she was related to another convicted serial killer in Perth. While in prison, she met Catherine Burney, who was involved in the murder business with her partner. The matronly criminal said that sex during the murder was the most powerful and pleasurable experience of her life. After she shared this, Barry became obsessed with the idea. On October 28th, the jury deliberated the verdict. It took 3 hours for the jury to find the criminals guilty. Wilma Baker received 10 years for kidnapping, 3 years for rape, and a life sentence for murder. Thanks to her cooperation with the prosecution, however, she remained eligible for parole. The deliberations on Barry's sentencing lasted 6 hours. The pervert was found guilty of murder, kidnapping, and rape. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and his case was placed in the no-release file. However, the couple's story didn't end in prison. Barry began boasting to his cellmates about his criminal achievements and told them that he had been involved in a similar crime. The criminal spoke about the massacre of 31-year-old teacher Helene Mary Fenley, who had disappeared on October 29, 1988. As it turned out, Wilma was also involved in this incident. It was determined that Helene had caught Barry during an attempted car theft. Wilma admitted that she saw her husband kill the teacher, after which they put the body in the trunk and dumped it at a landfill near Brisbane. At the same time, Barry remained silent despite the police's efforts to get him to speak. He provided no information about the second victim, Helene Fenley, likely because he hoped to challenge his conviction for Sian's murder in the future. Nevertheless, in 2007, a confession regarding Sian's murder was obtained from him. The criminal confirmed that he had killed her. He described in detail what had happened, and his story matched Wilma Baker's testimony. Wilma suffered from attacks by her fellow inmates. She was regularly beaten and was once severely injured by a blow to the head with a tin can. To prevent her from being beaten to death, she was transferred to a more secure prison. Here, she converted to Christianity and seemed to be on the path to reform. The woman applied for parole 3 times, but each time it was denied. In 2007, she divorced her murderous husband. The woman had serious health problems. She was overweight and diabetic. In 2008, her condition worsened so much that the doctors had to place her in a medically induced coma immediately after a heart surgery. The police hoped that she would make a few more confessions about other crimes on her deathbed. The couple was suspected of committing many more abductions, rapes, and murders in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, Wilma died at the age of 64 without regaining consciousness, taking all the information about the criminal activities of these vile creatures to the grave. This heavy burden, of course, still lies on Barry. The law enforcement authorities are confident that the criminal will never confess to further crimes. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.